Hello, everybody, people who I hope are joining us online. Welcome to a seminar relating to the parliaments in the Gulf states. Does the existence of parliaments, and we've put it in quotation marks because do they really resemble parliaments that many of us are familiar with in the countries in which some of us live? And we're asking whether parliaments in the Gulf states really mean that people in the Gulf have a voice in public affairs. We have a number of us, a small number of us in Geneva, and hopefully more of you online and indeed joining us online. I'll just run through the total number of speakers, some of whom you'll be able to see on the screen anyway. From my left, top left in any case, is not in the order in which he'll be speaking, is Ahmad Al-Mukhaini, who's an independent political economist and public policy analyst from Oman. And then my screen, I'm in the middle. On the top right for me, it's Luciano Zaccara. If you want to wave to indicate who you are for your other, for those who may have different setups on their screens, that might be useful. He's joining us from Buenos Aires. He's a professor in Gulf politics at Qatar universities, along with a number of other roles that he fulfills. But one of particular interest to me is the director of Observatorio Político y Electoral del Mundo Árabe y Musulmán. It's practice of my Spanish for today. And also Stacy Strobel, joining us from the US, professor in criminology at Shenandoah University. Bottom left-hand for my screen, in the middle of my screen, Professor Simon Mabon, joining us from Lancaster in Britain. And bottom right for me is Kristen Dewan-Smith from the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, who's recently been in Kuwait. Now I'm going to turn the screen to get our participants in Geneva. First, starting with Jawad Fayrouz, who is the director of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights and a former parliamentarian himself. Sarah Lee Whitson, the executive director of Dawn, formerly with Human Rights Watch and very well known. And at the far end of the table, certainly not least, is Falah Said, who's a human rights officer, thank you, Falah, at the MENA Rights Group. There is a particular order in which I wanted to go in today, on the basis that I did think at the beginning that Sarah Lee would have to leave, but you may not actually have to leave. I'm going to run today's session as a sort of as a conversation. I said we'll start with Sarah Lee, but to have a scene setter before turning to Sarah about Saudi Arabia and so on. I'd like to ask Simon, who's worked a lot on these issues, as a scene setter, just to tell us about, what are the challenges that you have faced as in the work that you've done with the sectarianism proxies and desectarianization project. This is the SEPAD project that you run, that you're a director of. What are the challenges you faced in engaging with this issue, with parliaments, and trying to work out what people think about governance and what they want from their governance in the Gulf? One might say these states are so rich, it doesn't actually really matter what people think so much. So tell us about that, if you could.
Yeah, thanks, Drury. Thank you for having me. It's good to see so many friendly faces, familiar faces, new faces, and I'm delighted to be part of this really valuable, important set of discussions. So as Drury's mentioned, I and other colleagues, including Stacey, Luciano, and indeed many others, have been working on some of these questions and doing research on the Gulf and broader political dynamics for a while now. And there's a whole host of challenges at play in engaging in this process, methodologically, politically, and conceptually, to name but three, and of course financially. And I think over time those different processes, those different challenges have begun to increase, making it harder and harder for us to gauge what the real dynamics at play in these discussions are. So of course you've got the initial question about methods. What is it that we're trying to get at here? Are we doing a granular deep dive into the views of several interviewees, which is perhaps a little bit easier and a little bit easier to gauge, to go into a more deep dive process of qualitative research? Or are we wanting to get a more sort of survey-based, broad brush approach to capture as many views as possible? Now, that quantitative process, that quantitative method process, is incredibly challenging, and yet it's also incredibly rewarding if you can do it in the right way. So the first thing to say is, of course, cost. These are incredibly expensive things to do. Survey companies charge a lot of money for obvious reasons. They are time consuming and they are very challenging. Then there are the various types of restrictions that are in place. The restrictions and the sort of informal and formal restrictions that survey companies themselves place on the types of surveys and the types of organizations that they would work with. They would choose to engage in research, or indeed not to engage in research, depending on the types of questions being asked. So there's an initial sort of vetting process in terms of whether the survey organization would even touch the survey instrument itself before then submitting it to various ministries for official approval. So there is a degree of sort of methodological censorship that goes on before you even get to the data analysis part. And when we've done these types of surveys in Kuwait, Iraq, and Lebanon, and elsewhere, we've had to be very careful with the types of questions that we're asking, and trying to ask questions that allow us to extrapolate the types of things that we want to look at, whilst not necessarily asking them outright, because we wouldn't necessarily be allowed to ask them outright. And so this poses challenges in terms of the type of analysis that can be done. It poses challenges methodologically, and it makes it really kind of difficult to answer the question, Drury, I'm afraid. But that is what is so very important about discussions like this. The work that Salam, DHR, and others are doing, Dawn and the like are doing, really helping to add flesh to the sort of the bones of broad survey projects like the Arab Barometer and like the stuff that Sapad has done before. So it's obviously a deeply sensitive set of issues, but with the right people involved, asking the right questions in the right ways, I think it's incredibly valuable. But in terms of the second question that you asked around whether this type of political action and activity is needed, I'm often reminded when people ask about this, I'm reminded of the work of Ibn Khaldun and his magisterial work, the Muqaddamah, where he talks about politics being about the survival of the species, politics being about people. And if that's the case, then it's absolutely essential that people have a say in how their lives are run, how their lives are ordered. It's not just about accepting the basic needs of economic largesse, let's say. But at the same time, if you flip the Ibn Khaldun observation on its head and say politics is about the survival of the species, well, you can easily make the argument that the species is being protected by and served by those in positions of power. Now, this is not a position that I hold. I make that very, very clear. I do not hold that argument. But that is an argument that is often being made. For a book project that I worked on a few years ago, I did interviews with people about instability, uncertainty, and political engagement. And I was told time and time again by people from the Gulf that their political leaders, and I won't elaborate just now on which countries they were from, but their political leaders regularly said, we don't want you to engage in politics. We don't want formal elections or parliamentary activity, because if we do that, we'll end up like Syria. We'll end up like Yemen. And it was a narrative that politics in this type of parliamentarian way breeds chaos. And I know that I'm not the only one to have got that type of argument from people. So it's really difficult here And in that type of landscape, well, why are people going to express themselves in a way that is clearly transparent when they don't know the type of researcher that is asking the questions? So there's an additional issue at play methodologically in terms of the analysis, in terms of transparency, and in terms of the safety of the people that we're even talking to. So I guess in short, it's challenging methodologically, it's challenging intellectually, it's challenging in terms of personal safety of interviewer and interviewee, and yet it's also incredibly important. And so I'm really, really thankful that Salam and many others are doing this really valuable work. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks so much. I didn't expect the name of Ibn Khaldun to be referenced this evening, but you did talk a lot about the challenges that this process faces. With those challenges in mind, we will turn to Sarah Whitson, the director of Dawn, who joins us, and I will ask Sarah to discuss the role of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian, possibly the UAE's assemblies, but also if Sarah, if you wish to address the idea of assemblies in general and whether or not they really count in helping to shape a country's human rights situation.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Great to see you. Great to see you, Kristen, in particular. So we, I guess, are talking about, or I'm talking about Saudi Arabia and the problem of democracy, the problem of the absence of democracy. And, you know, whether or not this matters probably is in the eyes of the beholder, because the model that Saudi Arabia is putting forward now is prosperity without democracy, even social change without democracy. So very much directed from above, in ways that actually are quite popular among the youth of the country. So in the short run, this model in Saudi Arabia, perhaps fashioned in some ways on other absolutist states that have nevertheless made economic progress, is not one that is being very actively contested from within Saudi Arabia. At the moment. The problem, of course, as all of you experts will know better than I do, is the lack of stability and the volatility of a system that relies on power exercise through a single person, absolutely with no checks, no balances, no accountability, and no opportunity for the people in the country to be involved in the change, to have a voice and say in how change takes place. It was interesting that looking into the history of the Shura Council, which is the body that ostensibly Saudi Arabia includes in various intergovernmental parliamentary, global parliamentary events. It sends representatives from the Shura Council as if they are a parliament. You know, they're not a parliament, of course. And they are purely advisory. They are not elected. They are entirely appointed with 150 members. And they actually have a beautiful physical space that very much looks like a parliament. In fact, it's probably much nicer than most of the actual parliaments around the world, because they have like computer screens and, you know, very polished wood. I've actually visited the Shura Council on 2 occasions. And now I think 20% of the seats are reserved for women. This was a reform made by King Abdullah just after he also decreed that women could vote in the short-lived municipal elections. There are now currently 30. But of course, this body can at most make recommendations to the royal rulers and express its opinion on the law. If you go to the Saudi government's website, that's the word they use, express its opinion. But I think for all intents and purposes, given that it has no legislative powers, perhaps it can recommend legislation. It really I think is really nothing more than window dressing. I'm not even sure that it's any sort of actual gauge for popular opinion. You can see an absolute ruler choosing to have some kind of a appointed representative body from around the country where at least it can have a sense or a feeling of what the public in each of these provinces thinks. But it doesn't serve that function. It really serves to validate what the royal family does. And in fact, I think it's long served for cover for the government's own policies. I remember when we would take up the issue of women driving or women's guardianship, they would say, well, the Shura Council, they don't want these things. So they don't want women driving. They are the ones who are opposing it. So basically acting as a cover for these. The municipal council elections were, I think, a more interesting example of the Saudi government trying to dip its toes into some kind of democratic process. Of course, because it is behind its Gulf peers, which do have some semblance of an elected parliament. B, obviously greatly behind Iran, which I think it considers its main competitor in the region in many ways, that has a parliament that actually passes laws and legislation, and a system where may be highly controlled, but still, we don't know who the president is going to be when there's an election. There is some kind of a process which does serve as some kind of a gauge on public opinion. It was interesting, though, that the municipal elections actually preceded the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the mid-1920s. And there were elections for other municipalities between, in periods of the night, there were elections for half the municipal councillors, only for men over the age of 21. In 2009, the elections for municipal council were postponed, ostensibly so that they could expand the suffrage in the municipal elections to women, which they did, and the municipal council elections did take place in September 2001. And I think it's very important to see those as an effort to respond to the Arab uprisings and the dramatic changes that happened until September 2001. But in fact, women were not allowed to vote, I guess, until 2015, with 2/3 of the seats now elected, another concession to the demands for democratization that were taking place in Saudi Arabia, that were fairly spread widely, not massive protests like in Egypt or Syria, but nevertheless protests wanting some form of democratization. I'm interested, of course, the big breakthrough with the 2015 municipal elections was that women could participate and could run as candidates, even though those candidates were highly vetted. And as many of you may know, the women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia were well involved in demanding the right to vote and trying to run for elections, like Sama al-Badawi, like Lujain al-Hathloul, like many others, women who, of course, paid dearly for their activism for women's rights once Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman came into power. The last elections were meant to be held in 2019, but they were indefinitely postponed. And and in 2021, the Ministry of Rural and Municipal Affairs formally declared that the term of this council elected in 2015 was officially dissolved. So even having people sort of remain in these municipal posts was deemed unacceptable, and there has not been a peep from the Saudi government about even that fractional little representational body of municipal provinces that are responsible for things like garbage collection and water and maybe development building.
So just really quick, while you're addressing municipal council, the municipal council is one that you lingered on as arguably being the most positive. Is there any informal methods of consultation where people can make their views or their pains, their suffering known to notables, and for it to actually count for anything?
Well, two things. One is, I mean, the Shura Council is that consultative body, and that is what it's formally presented to express its where under the Saudi constitution, I believe any citizen can appear before the royal family to express their grievances and complaints. But that is about individual. I think anyone is going to saunter up to him and complain about him. So at most, they might complain about other people. But in terms of the government's own failings, the penalty for people who express their opinions, express their views, even in courteous letters asking for some kind of democratic change, is extreme sanction and extreme punishment. One other positive development I would point to, and I think it's a very important development, is the emergence of a democratic party in exile, and that's NAS, which is headed by some incredible Saudi human rights activists and academics, like Abdallah Al-Ode, who is now the Secretary General, Yahya Al-Asidi, who is the founder, Madawi Al-Rashid, she's acting as the spokesperson now for the party. Interestingly, they just held a conference in Washington, D.C. I think it was meant to be their national conference convening. They had a much wider turnout than they expected. Everything was streamed live. And according to Abdullah, the video of the convening was viewed from Saudi Arabia 40,000 times. There are 40,000 unique views for the NAS, the National Assembly Party, or the People's Party. And I, am very hopeful, and I can't emphasize enough how important I think it is for a party like NAS to exist, even if it doesn't have power, even if it's in exile, for a couple of reasons. One is to hear Saudis speak and model the sort of representation they do want to have in a government, to present the ideal and the vision of Saudi people having a democracy. It's not unfathomable. There's nothing unique about Saudis that sort of uniquely requires them to live under an absolute dictatorship. But second of all, I think it's important to have basically a possibility for a democratic government in waiting. Because these extreme dictatorships are very brittle, they are very tempestuous, they are very unreliable. And if you look at Saudi policies for the last 5 years, you can see that volatility, and with that comes risk. It's very hard, though, for people to take risks unless they see that there's an alternative option that they can envision. I'm afraid I've gone too long, and I'm going to pause there.
Yes,
Yes,
I'm going to.
I have gone too long.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
sorry.
fine. Thank you very much. About Saudi Arabia, first of all, it's a highly mixed picture, couched in a situation in which actually the voices of the people in real terms is not reflected very much at all. And in fact, the last thing that you were saying seemed to get you the most excited was about NAS as something that did represent a body in exile, that did represent the aspirations, the voices of those who want to have a voice. But also your reference of what the history of the municipal elections, a municipal system was certainly a surprise to me, much earlier than I thought it would be. Okay, completely different shift now, and I know Kristen did indicate before we came on line today that she might have to go earlier. We're going to turn to you, Kristen Dewan Smith in Washington, D.C. Kristen has been a very close follower of the situation in Kuwait. Was in Kuwait, I recall, from your X or Twitter account during the April elections, and you've been commenting quite a lot about the suspension of Parliament just 6 weeks later in May. It's the most active Parliament in the Gulf. And before I ask you to sort of unpack your observations about the Kuwaiti situation, I just want to remind people that we're live broadcasting on YouTube and from the Salam Twitter account in English and Arabic. So Kristen, can you unpack what is happening in Kuwait and whether or not that parliament, as perhaps seems to be in kind of contrast to what Sarah was saying, whether that parliament represented a reflection of people's voices and whether or not that shaped their human rights situation. Over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Drury, and thanks to the Slam Center and all the other organizations participating. I think this is a very important and a very timely topic. Just to let you know, too, I will be able to stay with you for the whole thing because I'm very eager to hear everyone else's voices. So, as Drury mentioned, I was in Kuwait for the elections, and maybe that's a good place to start because I was there actually as part of an official delegation. I was welcomed there and invited there by the Ministry of Information, who was very eager, as the government, the Kuwaiti government, to demonstrate to all of us, and this was an international delegation of over 80 people, the parliament, the electoral process, and to give a deeper understanding of the parliament in Kuwait. And I think that's important to note because that means that this is something that the government's very proud of. I met with all of the people working in the Ministry of Information. They were very proud to be sharing this with us. And maybe I can just talk through, this delegation, we were welcomed into the Parliament building where we visited the library, the resources that were used by the parliamentarians and their work, and the officials that could help them with their research. We were able to enter into Abdullah Salim Hall, which of course is the hall named after the royal who's kind of the ruling family member who's kind of most associated with this transition in Kuwait that gave them this kind of formal participation in a parliament that really does have a strong voice. And I think that is important to underline. Unlike the Shura Council that Sarah's been describing, the Kuwaiti parliament is fully elected. It is a legislative body. It does have powers of some degree of oversight. It can, in fact, question ministers and in some cases remove ministers as well. And so it is a significant body and the most important, I would say, elected and legislative body in the Gulf, and even competing, I guess, in the broader Arab world. After visiting the parliament, we were taken to the Center for Research and Studies, where a scholar was there to provide to us this deep history of Kuwaiti democracy and democratic practice and political participation, which included a deep history back, you guys who know the Kuwaiti history, to the 20s and 30s, when the Kuwaiti public was involved, big, important families involved in pushing for municipality, kind of as what Sarah had been talking about, and then eventually an elected assembly. Also, of course, leading finally to this constitutive assembly around the time when Kuwait got its independence, and the establishment of a very strong constitution that underlies the basic rules that constitute this parliament. We were able to visit all of the polls that took place at that time, meet with candidates, meet with the judges who oversee this process, meet with the public that were voting, openly talk with anybody we wanted to. We were there until midnight when the polls closed for this special Ramadan election. I have to say, it was really fascinating to see, and I was not sure if this would be the case because any of you who know Kuwaiti political history know that it has been quite tempestuous of late. There have been a lot of these kind of dissolutions in which we've had multiple elections. These are constitutional dissolutions. So Kuwaitis have been dragged to the polls a lot, numerous times. I think this may have been the third or fourth election in 3 or 4 years. But you still had over 60% turnout. And we were also able to meet with some of the winning candidates. And I found this really fascinating because I was sitting around with a delegation of these other foreigners, some of them coming from the Gulf, in fact, who were chatting with these Kuwaiti parliamentarians and really interested in how they saw their role and their power and how they exercised that. And in fact, we met with one parliamentarian, Abdul Karim Al-Kandari, who had ostensibly been responsible for the early election call because of a speech that he made before the parliament. And he quite explicitly said that, some of the people visiting asked him, why do you press things in a way so far? Isn't this kind of a sensitive thing that you should, just kind of responsibly use your power? And he explicitly said, that is our role. It's much easier to sit in this parliament and just be cooperative and accept everything. But if we want to keep our practice, and I'm not quoting him here, but I'm giving you just an idea of it, then we have to be sort of brave and stand up for our constituencies and what we see our role in this parliament. As you mentioned, then 6 weeks later, the parliament was dissolved by the Emir, and in this case, it was done in an unconstitutional fashion. And they're now saying that the parliament will be suspended, the Emir said in a speech, for no more than 4 years. So there's an expectation that the parliament will come back, but we don't know. We don't know in what fashion it will come back. There's been no guarantees about that. In fact, there's explicitly been argued that there will be changes probably in the system to help democracy work better in Kuwait. And I think, for those observers, including those of us who were invited delegates there, I think there's some concern there's understanding, I think, of Kuwait and the difficulties that have been in the country. We know that for whatever reason, and we can talk about why, and I think there's multiple reasons why the system hasn't been able to deliver to Kuwaitis what they expect in terms of the services and the development that they would like to see. That there has been this long tradition of participation, which was clearly laid out to us, that Kuwaitis were clearly very proud of, and that there is a real concern, that be maintained and protected, particularly as I think we'll hear in the other examples in the Gulf that we don't really have a similar example like that. So I'll just stop there and let you follow up with other questions. But I'm glad that you asked me about that experience, because I think I'm really happy that I was able to go in April, because I was really able to hear from Kuwaitis the value that they place on the system.
Kristen, just one really quick follow-up, if you will, and I'm glad you're staying to the end. Look, you made it, and yet, following the dissolution, apart from a few voices, and indeed some former parliamentarians have been prosecuted, there seems to have been very little pushback. And that seems to kind of fly in the face of what you've been saying about how important the parliament seems to have been. So how do you account for what seems to have been very little protest, save for a few voices, just in the last minute or two?
That's a fair question, and I think it's an important one. And I think people are getting making improper assumptions about what that means. First off, I know that the parliamentarians were planning to get together immediately. The parliament that had just been dissolved were planning to get together and to organize as a meeting and then have a response. And they were pretty much told they should not do that. They were told that would not be seen as favorable and that there would be consequences for the person holding that meeting. I think their outreach to the Emir has not been welcomed at this point. I think there's a clear sense that, no, I'm going in this direction, and you just need to be silent at this point. I've been tracking quite closely the parliamentarians, and it is true that they have gone quite quiet, but not completely quiet. You will see some of the parliamentarians commenting in particular on fellow former members who have been arrested, commenting on, that they received due process and these sorts of issues. Even in the face of there have been some arrests, I have to say a limited number, but these are former parliamentarians who have now been arrested and sentenced. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that there is a threat to people, and a threat in Kuwait in a context too where there's been a lot of withdrawal of citizenship, which is for people who have enormous benefits from their citizenship, and this extends through their children and their following lines. That's a huge risk that people take in losing that. And I think we also need to respect the sophistication, if I can say that, of the Kuwaiti people. I think they know that they're dealing with a new Emir who's coming from a security background, who they know doesn't have kind of the experience of dealing with the give and take in politics. And there's a sense that they don't know exactly where this is going, and they don't want to take actions that will prevent the return of the parliament and in a positive way. So I think people are trying to be a bit circumspect at the same time to lay down certain markers about the return of the parliament, about perhaps that any changes that be made should be put forth to the parliament after that time, which is another important case. And I think as well, we have to remember that it's summer, and there's an understanding that at this point there would be no ability to really mobilize people. And especially when there are some people that want to see what happens. But again, that's a long kind of description to say that I wouldn't want people to think that Kuwaitis aren't concerned, that they don't care about this. I think there is a lot of concern. I think there is there's a broad array of Kuwaitis across all different kinds of religious backgrounds and stuff that would want to see the parliament returned.
All very, very careful. So Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, two very, at least according to, before we get on to Stacey later, two very different situations, very different contexts. Now, Oman is perhaps the least well-known to many in the world about really anything that goes on there, at least of all the assembly. Ahmed Mukhaini joining us from, I guess, from Muscat. Look, could you just unpack for us, maybe some basic information about what the assembly, the National Assembly, is, if it is a national assembly, what powers does it have, how is it elected, and on to the main point of what we've been talking about is, can it reflect concerns and the voices of the people there? Over to you, Ahmed.
Thank you. Am I audible to you? Can you hear me?
All good, all good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. Perhaps before I just answer that question very briefly, I would like just to mention that the discourse surrounding the parliamentary efficacy at large, but particularly their efficacy in representing the people and channeling the voice of citizens in the Gulf is quite complex and multifaceted. This is not a defense. It's just, I think sometimes we can, including me, because of the prevalent academic models, we may actually fall into the trap of oversimplifying this relationship and do a very straight comparison between parliaments in the Gulf and parliaments in established democracies. And if I may just mention here, my experience in 2011, when we had the Omani Spring, if we can call it that way, I traveled across the country talking to people about constitutional monarchy, and this is a time to actually think about limiting the powers of the Sultan and so forth, and establish this kind of system. And everybody, most people, laughed at me and they say, what's the point of having a Sultan who cannot rule? So that kind of underscored the kind of gap that we have between the average person understanding of a political system and institutions like Shura or a parliament and their expectations of how they want to be governed. So I just wanted to actually mention this before I go and answer the question. In Oman, we are like in Bahrain, we have a bicameral council. We have an upper chamber appointed entirely, called the State Council or Majlis al-Dawla. It's appointed by the Sultan. And we have a lower chamber, which is an elected chamber called Majlis al-Shura. So Majlis al-Shura in Oman is not appointed like in Saudi or in Qatar. It's more, it's totally elected. It's universal suffrage. So anyone, including naturalized Omanis, have the right to actually go into and vote in and participate in the electoral process within Majlis al-Shura. Legally speaking, it provides a very structured framework for legislative governance in terms of either issue or amendments, as well as citizenry participation and representation, and finally, some kind of government oversight. But at least as far as the law is concerned, when it comes to reality, the basic law does specify that the Sultan is the ultimate legislator. Everything has to be passed and issued by him. It is not a ceremonial or a kind of procedural role. It is an actual role that he has that ultimate final say whether a law or an amendment to the law can actually go forward. He even has the authority to suspend the law, because the royal orders can be above the law. They can suspend the law or actually can give a different interpretation of the law. So looking at the positive side of things, we do have a universal suffrage for everyone. Since 1994, we've been having women participating either in terms of candidacy or in voting, and the women participation has been growing steadily. In fact, in the last election, they crossed 60% of the voters, the actual voters, not the registered voters. So when it came to the registered voters, they were only 49 or 0.8 or 50%. But when it came to the actual voters who went and cast their votes, women were about 60 or 65. I mean, I have the figure somewhere here. There is, of course, an understanding that these women were mobilized by either tribal leaders or opinion leaders. I mean, as an observer, I do not think that these women had their own political interest to actually go and vote. Touching upon some of the issues raised by Kristen, demography-wise, I have been monitoring the demography of the membership of the Majlis, and surprisingly, it does map to a reasonable extent members, not the Ad-Dawla members, because the Dawla are appointed. They usually are people who have either retired or former military officers, current academicians, and so forth. So they do not reflect the demography of the society. But the Shura members do reflect the demography in terms of age, not in terms of gender. Because this time, unfortunately, we have no female members, no lady members. The maximum number we've had in the past were 2 members, so about 2.6% of the representation. In the Dawla, the upper chamber, we have more. We have about 14% representation of women in that council. Now, just going back to the very brief question, I actually did a paper looking at this, focusing on one particular period, and Luciano knows all about it. And unfortunately, Majlis al-Shura, though on paper has powers, they can establish vote of confidence, they can call ministers for questioning. It is not really an effective checks and balances tool. It is a means of engaging and involving members of the public, represented by Majlis al-Shura, but they do not have a real influence, or at least that's what the government is trying to make. They are not really publicized in that regard. And in quite a few issues, some of the examples I mentioned in the paper, like, when the ministers do actually, or the Council of Ministers do exercise some kind of influence or pressure on Majlis al-Shura members so they can vote in line with the view of the government. And then when I used to work there for some time, and then when I asked them about all of this, they said, well, let's give the government what they want, but then we can actually scrutinize them later when they come for questioning, which they do in the sense that they ask questions, but these questions never materialize in dismissing a minister. I mean, we have the vote of confidence competence within the Majlis al-Shura law. It was never exercised. Every time the Majlis al-Shura asked for it, the Council of Ministers gave several excuses. And nowadays, we have a moment of truth coming up. As you might be aware, Oman is trying to introduce personal income tax. So the personal income tax law is before the Majlis now, and they have to make a decision on it before they suspend for summer. And as far as I know from my internal discussion, they are not going to approve it. They have to find a way of saying that nationally to the government, because members and the government are pushing for that law to be approved. I would like perhaps to stop by saying just one or two points, because I don't want to take over a lot of my time. The two chambers, particularly the upper chamber, have become a platform for social mobility. So Majlis al-Dawla members now are being selected from civil society organizations and opinion leaders. And also the Majlis al-Shura has become a stage for exposure. Ministers, before they come to the Majlis for questioning, they tend to prepare about 6 months in advance, because they have been told that the Sultan actually watches these sessions. Thank you.
Yeah, you ended with two very, very important and very useful points, Ahmed. Thank you very much. Look, we're going to turn now to Jawad Fayrouz, a former parliamentarian himself, the director of Salam for Democracy and Human Rights. The last session of the Majlis,
House of Representatives.
The House of Representatives in Bahrain was marked by considerable debate and discussion, and I will leave it to Jawad to tell us a little bit about its powers and limitations. Also, maybe talk a little bit about what that expression led to, what caused it, and maybe what some of the repercussions will be. I'm just going to turn the computer to try and capture him now.
Okay, thank you, Drury. Let's shift my position that I can avoid the light, the reflection, the light coming over my face. Yeah, maybe that, or Drury can shift with you. Maybe here, maybe he's sorry. Okay. Yes. Okay, thanks a lot. First of all, I'd like to mention that we have to consider that the case of the parliament in Bahrain is considered to be now more than half of century age-wise. After the independence, 1973, we had the first parliament, which didn't go just for 2 years, then being dissolved by the former prime minister in Bahrain. And it's been national agreement with the government level. That's, again, we're going to have two houses, Shura Council and the representative of House of Representatives, which is elected one. But due to the 2002 constitution, which is uncontractual and been imposed by the king, and it was not part of the agreement of the National Act, which been agreed on. So we have now two houses in Bahrain, which have the equal rights of the legislation. So any bills, if it comes to the government, it will be discussed in the House of Representatives, but it should be approved by the appointed council. They have the same number of the members. Elected council consists of 40 members, and the elected council, I mean the appointed council, consists of 40 members too. they have equal rights with the rights of the passing legislation, although I believe the appointed council have further power. Why? Because at the end, it will end up in the hand of the appointed council. If they didn't pass it, then it will not go through. And even there is another barrier, the final one, in the hand of the king. So he have to ratify all these bills later on to be as a law, which is usually if the government or the royal court or even the king, they didn't desire to pass any bills, so directly appointed council will be instructed on that one. That will be frozen with them. Second point is that the king himself, he utilized his power to use the royal decree to pass legislation as a royal decree in the recession period of the elected council and shura council. What happens if required to extend his power? He give the short period of the year to the elected and appointed council. So usually they are starting, say, in November, and they don't exceed then the first week of May. Maximum, they will go up to end of May, to give himself a right to have the power of legislation during the session of the parliament or the both councils. And what happens, although constitutionally there is restrictions over when and how the king to apply his right to pass any legislation or to use royal decree, and that should be related to the emergency cases. But up to now, almost all royal decree that he passed, it is nothing to do with emergency. I can give a few examples now. Additional phrase given the government right, no need to get any approval or any voting, that they can deal with any members. And here I want to emphasize in few points. Okay, my colleagues, they indicated about the conditions on the House of Representatives, appointed and so on in the GCC in general. But Gulf citizens are asking these questions. When they will get and within what roadmap toward the elected parliament that they can have the full power. No one can answer. We don't know. No one wants to answer this question from the authorities. Will we gonna have it after 10 years, after 20 years, after 50 years? Will we gonna have, let me say, gradual reducing the power of appointed council, and the elected council gradually will pick up until we reach the full democracy after a century, half of century? No one can answer. At the same time, still we are under the mercy of makrama, as honor by the king, that he can provide such a privilege to his citizens, and he will decide what type and what area of the space of the freedom of the types of the representation to be given. Unfortunately, what we can realize it is totally absolute monarchies that we are seeing, and it is enhancing, unfortunately. You can see even a majority of the sport clubs in the Gulf are in the hand of the ruling family. Even so many charity funds in the hand of the ruling families. And even if someone by election came to these positions, there are going to be a lot of restrictions if you have certain political affiliation. And here I can bring up the case of the banning political societies in Bahrain in particular, to give a more further clear picture. As you know, after uprising Bahrain 2011, Al-Wafaq being banned officially in 2006. The chairman of Al-Wafaq been sentenced to life since 2014. Wa'ad is being banned in 2017. And what the authorities done in 2018 in the political rights legislation, to amend it in a way that all the members of these banned political societies, they don't have any political rights whatsoever. They cannot vote in any election. They cannot candidate in any post in the elections. Even they extended through the NGOs law where they cannot be part of any board of directors of any civil societies. They cannot be board of director of the sport club, charity funds, I don't know, any other social or cultural clubs and so on. So
Sure. Just one final quick question. In one sentence, if you could, you have Bahrain has got elections in 2026. You've presented a very mixed picture, broadly not as mixed in terms of the other ones that we've heard. You've asked a very important question about Gulf citizens, asking when will there be elected parliaments that with full powers and so on. How do you see the 2026 elections in Bahrain unfolding? In one sentence, please, as much as you could, very briefly.
in short, when the crown prince came in power after the previous or former prime minister, Uncle of King, he passed away, people thought that he is a little bit having a reformist program. But that indication is no more there. It looked like 2026 going to be repetition of the previous elections, 2022, 2018, 2014, and so on. And there is no indication that the government are ready to be in a way of making any types of the dialogue. We hope so, it happens, but there's no indication, or to adopt any political reforms where either to reduce the power of the appointed council, give more room to the will be changed, but there is no clear indication in that.
Thanks, Stuart. We're going to switch again.
Okay.
And seamlessly, more or less seamlessly, try to go back to Kuwait with Stacey Strobel, who will share, I hope, some of the details, some of the data that the SAPAD project developed. And Stacey, if you would share some of the findings from the data that you were able to gather, the SAPAD project was able to gather relating to Kuwait. We're running a little bit behind time, so I might ask you just to be a little bit shorter, so to ensure that Luciano and his comparative work and Allah, who's sitting very patiently at the end, to get a kind of more granular human rights take on this, that we can get them in as well. So over to you, Stacey. Just some findings of the SAPAD data on.
Sure. I'll give some headlines and I'll do a little bit of interpretation, and then we'll get into some of the empirical findings. The information has not yet been released in a report, so this is new information outside of SAPAD. But what I found, so the survey was from 2021. It was a phone survey. It was randomized. It had a pretty good response rate of 41%, and it was designed as an omnibus survey in order to get at a number of social, political, and economic questions. I originally looked at the data as a criminologist, looking at things that are more around safety and stability, but along the way was able to also take a look at some of the questions that had specifically to do with Parliament. Okay, so this is a snapshot in time at 2021, but it does indicate that we should be much more critical about this sort of trope that Kuwait's democracy is healthy in sort of the usual measures. Certainly, relatively to other countries in the Gulf, it is better, but we shouldn't be satisfied with it by any means. And I think just the amount of dissolutions itself, a multiple in the last few years, is enough to make you wonder what is happening. But overall, what the data finds, if I don't have time to go into the pieces, that Kuwaitis do care a lot about political issues, and there's a really strong amount of engagement, but it's not necessarily about Parliament and voting. And I think this is really, really important because it suggests that the dissolutions may be having an effect. It suggests that, and these are just options, this survey, this is me interpreting now, it suggests that discourse from the royal family and elites around loyalty, the social media, all these other ways that people talk about politics may be very, very important, and maybe where people sort of operate, if you will, from their positions. It suggests that the sort of longue durée approach of the Gulf of consultation that's more rooted in local traditions still plays a role despite parliaments, and parliaments can function alongside potentially, but we don't want to leave out. We have to sort of look at decision making from my point of view as an anthropological function and find out where it's actually happening, and then maybe then we democratize it, rather than sort of this post-colonial position where we have this Western overlay of a parliament that then operates or doesn't operate in certain ways. So I'm trying to imagine something that might be a little bit more locally grounded, although we don't have time for that today. But what it looks like is that participation. So one of the questions was, did you vote in the last election? So this is 2021. So it would have been in the prior year. And it was about a 50-50. So, and it was statistically significant that men are much more likely to vote. So women, of course, have only had the vote for about 20 years. So, that suggests some cultural stuff that may be going on around there. Overwhelmingly, people 20 to 39 are more likely to feel that way. So we don't have party affiliation for a lot of these folks, which suggests that Parliament is not working for the average person. I should say that the average age of folks survey, it was 38 years of age on average. It was about 50-50 on gender, 79% Sunni, and 85% said they were religious or somewhat religious. So that just gives you sort of a snapshot of the folks that are answering these in a randomized survey. Furthermore, they are not necessarily the most educated. So this got out of the elite frame very, very clearly. And I think that's really, really important. A lot of folks that go in and study Kuwaiti parliament, and I've been in Kuwaiti parliament many years ago, snooping around myself, that's sort of one world. And I think the CEPED randomized phone survey, with all of its problems, and which we won't have time to get into, actually does give us a window on something a lot more popular. And so with so many people not feeling that a party represents them, interestingly, the one party that does come to the top, which again is still a minority of respondents, is the Islamist Party Justice and Peace, followed by the National Democratic Alliance, and then Popular Action, right? So just for folks that are following at that level. I will say that one of the things that really, really struck me was that young people are way more issue-oriented in their voting. By young people, I mean 20 to 39, than others, okay? But they're also, again, like I said, more likely to say that a party doesn't represent them. Okay, so this is really important because most respondents said that they were voting on agreement of issues. Okay, we don't have any interaction. People weren't voting on sect identity. Majority of people say that they're satisfied with government. Okay, and so we have this sort of interesting sort of situation where the real action isn't even happening in Parliament, though it is somewhat celebrated as being somewhat healthy. And I think that this is really important. And for me, we have to really look at this as an opportunity to reimagine, particularly with the disillusions. I mean, just so many of them. I just don't think that you can defend that as really being an operative representative democracy. So where are the decisions happening? And can we democratize those spaces and those places? That would be the question that I would get at. The other thing, and I think Krista made a really good point about the enormous benefits of, playing along with the status quo in terms of welfare benefits, but also the sort of focus on loyalty and unity probably leads to this sort of interesting mixed bag where people are really engaged, but they're also satisfied. And so when I look at some of these measures, because they don't all lead in one direction necessarily, I'm often thinking that there's this balancing out going on where people are only so likely in a panoply of questions to put themselves out there individually. And so then they'll sort of bounce around a little bit to sort of centralize or sort of de-oppositionize their responses. So you do see some things that are quite interesting. If I have any time, I could drill down on stuff that might be a little bit more empirical.
No, you don't, I'm afraid. I've got
Okay.
makrama to.
Well, I guess I didn't defend any of that, but that's what the data shows.
That's what the data shows, and that's fine. I mean, it's the part of probably the most from the human rights situation that kind of I wanted to hopefully kind of shape or have a background in this debate as well, to try to meld the kind of human rights and representation side. But I took away some really important points about no single party, save for one that seemed to be Islamists representing people and young people being far more issues focused. Penultimate, Luciano Zaccarda has done a lot of comparative work in the Gulf. I don't think this is very human rights oriented, but does it represent a manner in which the voices of those people, of the people in the Gulf, are represented? Luciano, what did your findings reveal?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and including me in this workshop. I have been listening to all of you. Actually, I've been doing a lot of research comparing electoral processes, not only within the GCC context, but also with Iran, which is actually my main area of expertise. I've been more focused on the electoral process themselves rather than the parliamentary activity, although I run some projects. Ahmad has been involved in one of them about parliamentary politics. And one of the things that I always discuss with people is the expectation of the voters when they participate in elections. I mean, we all know that some electoral processes do not have the impact on the political system that we may expect. And this is what I have been also teaching in the Gulf. I have been teaching in the Gulf for more than 11 years. So every time we discuss about why we are voting, what the people is expecting when they go to vote, and what is the relation between the voters and the candidates or the elected members. And I see that there is a big difference when we ask Qataris, Emiratis, Kuwaitis, or Iranians about what they expect. I mean, Christian gave a very good explanation on what the parliament or the assembly can do. Ahmed also mentioned about Oman, how people is getting more interested in elections because the parliament is changing itself in their role within the political system. In the Iranian case, this has been since the very beginning. The parliament has the opportunity to legislate. Not only to discuss the laws that they are proposed by the government, but to initiate laws. And this is something that the citizens know. The citizens know that the candidates they vote, they can influence on the political system, on the legal system, because they can suggest or propose, amend laws, and that they can discuss the budget as well. I mean, of course, the budget is presented by the government, but it's discussed by the parliament, and it needs to be approved. Therefore, negotiations should happen within the parliament, within the different factions, in order to get the budget approved. The same happened with the different laws. Of course, you always have a second chamber, which is the Guardian Council, that can put a lot of impediments in that. But we have a lot of elements that show that sometimes the parliament has more power than any other legislative system in the GCC context, in which most of them, they cannot even initiate legislation. They should only just sign what the government sent them. We have a case in Qatar that for the first time they had electoral legislative elections 2021. I assume that all of you are aware of that. And it was a process that created a lot of expectations among citizens. But the way in which the electoral process was conducted, leaving aside some people, I mean, the electoral process was not as transparent and inclusive as we expected, researchers and people that was interested in these things. And also the citizens felt that. So the expectations that were created were not satisfied. And therefore, probably next year, 2025, when the parliament will be renewed, we will not have the same enthusiasm that we had in 2021. Why? Because they realized that the parliament, at the end of the day, that all, when we compare the appointed one that existed until 2021 and the elected one. I had a discussion with someone that from the Amiridi one. He told me they wanted elections. They had elections to choose the members of the parliament. You know how long it takes for the debates. I mean, before they were taking 1 hour to approve the budget. Now they take half an hour, so they don't even discuss. So neither the citizens know exactly what the parliament can do in order to exert their influence. I mean, the voters' influence within the political process, nor the members of the parliaments want to exercise their right according to what the constitution said. The government say, you have the right, you can do it, but nobody dare to do something because you know that there are other ways to control the political system, that they are not written, the way in which candidates are selected, the way in which the distribution of seats is made. Therefore, we see that participation rates in the Gulf are going down. I mean, of course, there are exceptions or periods, but generally speaking, we see that the participation rate in the whole Gulf region, including even Iran and Iraq, we see that the political parties, candidates are struggling to get votes. We are going to have elections in Iran in 2 days, and everybody knows that the participation rate will be very low because, honestly, nobody's very interested in an electoral process that most of us know how it's going to be, the same as it happened in last presidential election when Raisi won. So while after 2011, there was a lot of expectation in the region, participation rate increased a little bit. I had the chance to visit, to observe the electoral processes in 5 of the 6 GCC states along this period, sometimes invited by the officials like in Oman and Kuwait, but also in a non-official way in the other countries. And I saw that there was much more expectation and much more interest because there was an expectation from the citizens that they can have at least some sort of influence over the political process. 2015, 2016, 17, 18, I also had the chance to visit some countries during elections, and I saw that this enthusiasm almost disappear. People keep voting, there is some interest in voting, but the expectations were not the same. I mean, the hopes that changes can happen within the system in all the region, and that they can exert some influence over the governments in terms of governance are very reduced. Regardless of what the people want to change, I mean, in Qatar, they don't want to change many things. We have to recognize that. And in other cases, we have much more interest from the citizens to change the situation. I mean, in Kuwait, it's very clear. In some other cases in which they want to control or limit the power of the executive powers. But in Qatar, this interest does not exist. So it is interesting to do this comparative work because you can see different opinions and different ways to understand what citizens can do and what members of the parliaments can do. I stop here. So.
Thanks so much, Luciano. The reference to Iran was not something that I expected this evening, but nevertheless interesting.
Sorry about that.
No worries. We're running out of time in the room rental, but we might hopefully be able to squeeze in a bit more time. The small number of people are leaving now. I am told by our technician that there are 513 viewers at the moment, which is nice. We're going to shift gears to wrap up and go back to the very core of why we're in Geneva, which is the human rights situation, and turn to Falah Syed, who's a human rights officer at MENA Rights Group. Thank you very much.
I can take. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Jury, and thanks for inviting me as well. I'll try to remember everything that has been said since I feel like I'm concluding everything. So hopefully I will have things in mind, but yeah, I'll try my best. I'll give a bit of a human rights approach to what we've discussed. I'll also touch a little bit about the issues of national human rights institutions in Gulf countries, which I think is important to discuss as well. And I think what we should keep in mind is clearly quite limited, and meaning that there's practically no space for expression of diverse opinions, for criticizing policies, for holding the government accountable. This will automatically make any kind or any possible citizenship participation in public life, merely artificial. And just to give, a little international law background, in international law, the right to participate in public affairs is recognized. And so it's in Article 25 of the ICCPR, for instance. And according to, it's commonly known that public affairs is understood to be a broad concept that relates to the exercise of political power, in particular the exercise of legislative, executive, and administrative powers. Citizens can therefore participate in the conduct of public affairs by either, exercising powers in legislative bodies or through freely chosen representatives. And it's clear from what we've talked about that, legislative bodies in Gulf countries only have very modest powers and seem to, have simply been created to allow the government to, tick a box, basically, with regards to its international obligations. And we can see that, in national constitutions of Gulf countries, because parliaments are provided with very limited powers. And it's usually the king, the sultan, the emir, who has actually both the executive and legislative powers. And the enactment of laws is in reality a royal prerogative. And yeah, I just can briefly cite the Bahraini case where members of the Shura Council are appointed by the king and are therefore not chosen. The same goes for Saudi Arabia, where the kings directly appoints the 150 members of the Majlis Shura. There's, therefore, if the kings is the one who appoints them, then there's obviously no space for any form of opposition in public life in these countries, and even less within the parliament. And we have to keep in mind that parliaments do play a central role in ensuring the respect of human rights. As it's the foundation of any democratic society. They can ensure that the adoption of they can ensure the adoption of human rights sensitive laws, support the ratification of human rights treaties, hold the government accountable. But how can this be possible in countries where, the idea of political pluralism is fragile or even non-existent? And yeah, just giving, again, the extreme case of Saudi Arabia, where political parties are forbidden and political dissent is effectively criminalized. And we can, just remember the case of the Saudi Civil and Political Rights Association co-founders and founders who have been arrested and sentenced to prison sentences in recent years, and they are still being held in prison to this day. And many other political activists continue to serve lengthy prison sentences for any form of dissent. And citing as well very quickly Bahrain, who has held elections on the 12th of November 2022 for the Council of Representatives. It showed, these elections showed that there is actually very little independent civil society and that any opposition was actually banned from running, as Jawad was saying. And all of these findings considerably impact the role that parliaments could play in safeguarding human rights in the countries, in drafting more protective laws, in ratifying human rights statutes, for instance. And what's even more concerning is the role that is played by national human rights institutions in that relation in Gulf countries. NHRIs, for those who don't know, are national bodies who are supposed to be independent, completely independent from the government, and who are mandated with promoting human rights, mainly through drafting, new laws and amendments, pushing towards the ratification of human rights treaties, and also hearing individual complaints. And in many cases, NHRIs and parliaments work very closely and could work closely, although they are supposed to be independent, but just to take measures to ensure the full compliance of human rights law. However, what we have observed is that in many Gulf countries, NHRIs are actually not independent. They are ineffective, and they are actually used as a whitewashing tool of the government. They do not push for the adoption of laws that would be more protective for human rights. And they, in fact, sometimes actively cover up human rights abuses that are being committed. And I'm thinking here of the Saudi Human Rights Commission, which is extremely problematic. And it's really, we can see that it's just this institution that was created to tick a box. And their legislative work is essentially consisting of praising the adoption of laws, or even giving false or misleading statements on legislative changes, without ever providing critical analysis on laws that have actually been widely criticized on human rights. And similarly in Bahrain, very quickly, if I have just 1 minute or...
And I have one very quick, we have to be out of this room, but I have a very quick follow-up question. If you could tie these together.
Sure.
Today is the International Day in support of victims of torture. We're talking about legislative bodies. We've heard that they don't really have very much power. You've just referenced the national human rights institutions of these differing states that kind of whitewash what's going on. How do we reconcile, how do we bring together the fact that torture does take place in these countries, GCC countries, they've got legislative assemblies, they've got human rights obligations. Is there a way to join that conundrum up? Or is it just us sitting, having meetings, having 500 some odd people view online and hope for the best?
It's a bit of the two. I mean, I'm not quite optimistic, but what I have to say is that in an ideal world, the role that NHRI plays in this is crucial, because when torture does occur, when there are human rights violations that do occur, it's really important that victims come forward to an independent body that will be the bridge between them and the parliament, and between them and any possible, parliamentary legislative action. This is not the case in Gulf countries, and we've seen this in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where the Saudi Human Rights Commission has visited detainees like Eugene Withrul or Salma al-Shab, who have voiced their human rights violations, the violations that they have been subjected to, the torture acts that they have been subjected to. But there has been obviously no follow-up, and there has been active covering up of these human rights abuses and all these claims that were made by Lejeune and Sadou.
And were any of those cases referenced in any of the councils, municipal or shura, in Saudi Arabia? Or
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not, unfortunately. But they have been referenced in our reports that you can read on the Saudi Human Rights Commission. Yeah.
So would you like to have the last word, as you come from perhaps the furthest away to be here, except for Luciano? Luciano's online. Any last word that you'd like to make? We've got a couple more minutes online, but although we do have to leave this room sort of nowish. With the camera facing you. Just any closing thoughts?
Yeah. I guess, just this week I was somehow caught in a Twitter exchange with an Arab man who was praising the Abraham Accords that the UAE had entered into with Israel, noting how stable the UAE is, and then insisting Arabs are not ready for democracy. And I think it lies at the heart of that a widely held view among many people that somehow democracy in the Middle East means Syria, democracy in the Middle East means Libya. And I think we all, as academics, as analysts, as researchers, need to cut through that lie, because it is a lie. What's happening in Syria has nothing to do with democracy. And the failures of Tunisia are not the failures of democracy. And, you know, we could go on, but I think we have a responsibility to make a better case as to why not only are Arabs ready for democracy, it's such an insulting, degrading expression to begin with, but why and how democracy can work. Because the propaganda of the ruling families is working and has worked. But, you know, it's something that we need to challenge by, you know, substantively and seriously trying to address some of the fears and concerns people have.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christine. We're going to wrap up now to the around 500 people who have joined us, and all of the 3 people in the room in Geneva. Sarah did say, oh well, there were more actually at the beginning.
They left.
Yeah, they left. Sarah did begin the event by saying we should begin. We should just hold these things online. I heard somebody shout my name.
Yeah, it was Kristen.
Yeah, Kristen, please.
Very small point.
Yeah.
I just want to say to stress that how this parliamentary and human rights things can happen in a positive way, just since we didn't have a positive example. You do not have Kuwaiti citizens disappear in the legal system. Citizens, I'm talking about here. And you do have, if there's contentions of any sort of abuse while in power, detentions of like torture, those have been discussed in the parliament. Of course, now the parliament's suspended. We'll see if that occurs. But I just wanted to mention that because at least it shows that you can have that positive dynamic. Leave it there.
No, that's very true. Yeah, of all the countries, Kuwait has got to be the one that is most able to do that. Look, we do need to sign off now. Our time is coming to an end online. Just leaves me to thank, as I see them on my screen, Simon, Stacey, Ahmed, Kristen, who's just spoken, Luciano in Buenos Aires, and of course the people here. I'm going to twist the screen a little bit. Jawad, Sarah, and voila. Thank you so much. Hopefully this has been useful and sobering. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.
Thank you.